In today's video, we are going to be actually starting in Procreate, making a concept sketch, pulling it over into Nomad as a reference, modeling it, and then getting it back over into Procreate for final painting. To do that, we'll have to go through another app, Forger, to create UVs for the model. It's not an elegant or great solution, but it does work, and I want to show you guys how to do that. I know after my last video, a lot of people were asking how they could just stay on the iPad and get from Nomad to Procreate, so that's exactly what we're going to do here. I will say in my last video where I sculpted a pumpkin and pulled it into Procreate by going through Blender to create UVs, that's probably the better option and the more correct option when you wanted to do something like that, but I realize it's not as convenient and takes a while. So until we have a better solution, really these two options are your best bet. If you don't want to go through Blender, you can actually go through ZBrush, and Glenn Southern over at Southern GFX, he's currently working on a video that's going to show that workflow, so stay tuned for that. So as I mentioned, I'm actually starting in Procreate here. I already started the video off with a rough sketch. Typically what I'll do is I'll make a really loose rough sketch on a layer, and I'll pull the opacity down on that layer and then create a new layer and start working over the top of that. Procreate is an absolutely top-notch app for painting, not just on the iPad, but pretty much anywhere, and I highly recommend it if you're not comfortable or used to it yet, that you do so. So here I'm just adding some color for fun. I pretty much have the sketch tightened up the way I'd like, and so we're getting ready to hop over to Nomad and begin the sculpt. So with that, I'll save this to images, hop over into Nomad, I'll pull this in as a reference image, scale it down, and start working on my sculpt. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the sculpting process. I've got plenty of videos on those. But here I'm just going to start blocking things in, start with the head, and then get the body in. And I'm actually going to be sculpting a low poly version of Ryu. I thought that would be fun, something I haven't really done before, or shown off how you can do kind of a low poly look here in Nomad. And because of that, I'm actually not going to spend too much time getting into the weeds on detail on this model. We'll have some general macro detail that's sculpted in, but I'm not going to polish the sculpt by any means. And you'll see how that works here in a little bit. Definitely need to go through the blocking stages. I've got most of the body area blocked in here, and now I'm kind of doing those secondary forms, blocking those in terms of detail with the eyes and brows and nose and mouth. The hair, I'm just use the Move Sharp brush to kind of pull those the hairs around to get those spikes that I need. For the hands, I'm creating a cube that I remesh and sculpt around and using some tubes, and then I just duplicate that hand and get it into place. I've got this all sped up so we can kind of get to the meat of this video, which is pulling this over into Procreate and painting it there. I think I spent maybe just over an hour on this sculpt, and here you're just seeing it condensed pretty heavily into about 5 minutes or so. Anytime you do a model, you want to make sure the silhouette looks good from all angles. And funnily enough, I think this pose is actually kind of similar to my Popeye sculpt. Even though here Ryu isn't running, he's getting ready to create a Hadouken. Get some feet in there. And this is just about as far as I'm going to go with detail. So here pretty soon you're going to see him go into low poly mode. And basically what I do is I get everything blocked in, and then I'll go into my geometry little menu here in Nomad, where you would typically go through and do the voxel remesh, and I'll do a decimate remesh, and I'll decimate it a bunch of times until I get kind of the low poly look I want for each part. Now, typically, if this were low poly work for a game, you would be doing retopo, or you would just be building the topology in another app. You know, Nomad can do a little bit of low poly work if you turn on wireframes and start with primitives, but it's not really built for that. However, you can decimate like a pro here in Nomad, and that's the way I'll do it. More or less, I'm just kind of using it for an aesthetic on this piece. I almost have all the forms in. I still want to get the tails of his headband in there, and the tails of his belt. So just using some tubes to get those pieces in. Okay, so here I've got those tails in. I will say that when I did export from Nomad to Forger, I did have a little bit of an issue with those tails. I made them a little bit thin, and then when they decimated, the mesh actually merged into itself, and it didn't like that in Forger. Took a little bit of troubleshooting, kind of go back and forth and figure out what the offending piece of geometry was, and I realized it was the tails on that bandana there. So to fix it, I simply remeshed, added some volume back in with the inflate brush, and then I decimated once again, and it worked just fine. So if you do end up with issues going from Nomad to Forger, it's just a matter of kind of isolating, selecting the pieces of geo you want to export until you can find the one that doesn't work. So I had to do that for a little bit. I'm getting pretty close here. I wanted to make sure those brows were on top of the headband in sort of a cartoony fashion, so they're really prominent and read well. And with that, I'm going to start the decimation process. So here you see I'm going into the geometry tab piece by piece and hitting decimate a bunch until I get the look I want. You can play around with the percentage of decimation as you do this if you're not getting quite the look you want. I did this just a little bit and just to get it dialed in, but overall I really like the look of decimation. It's a really cool faceted look. One other thing I noticed is here in Nomad, I really like how you see the normals are hard to where it does look very faceted and angular when he's low poly. However, the normals get smoothed out when you pull them over into Procreate. I couldn't find a good solution for maintaining those hard normals, getting it from Forger to Procreate. You know, if I was going through Blender or something on the PC, I would have this solved for that. But at the end of the day, it still looked pretty cool. There's something really cool about seeing these faceted edges. So much so, I think this would be a fun 3D print. And so I might do a 3D print of this guy. I could either do him on an FDM printer and make him large, or I'm thinking I might even make him in some transparent resin, kind of give him a crystal look, because that's kind of this faceted look has a really nice kind of crystalline look to it. I had forgotten to add in the tails of the belt. There, I just used some primitives, and I made sure that the subdivisions were turned all the way down to 1, so there weren't extra geometry in there. And I'm using the sculpt tool in the face just a little bit, using the move tool specifically to kind of push and pull some points. Again, I want to make sure those brows are really prominent and read really well. And I'm going through and labeling my parts. I thought this would be a good idea, but at the end of the day, they didn't carry over into Forger, so it's probably not necessary unless you're just really are picky about organization. So here I went through and named them all, and then I exported Forger, and they were not there. So heads up on that. So from here, I'm just going to export an OBJ and then go into Forger and import it. Comes through just fine. It comes through as one mesh. I scooted it up to where his feet are on the floor. Little tip, you should do that for later if you want to do the AR stuff. Here I ran a quick auto UV on it, pulled it into Procreate just to test it out. And you'll see it works, but honestly, the resolution isn't great in the areas I want it to be. And in some areas like the hands and stuff, it actually It looks really weird. Some areas were difficult to paint, but I covered it up here, and then I'll switch into 2D mode, and you can just see what a mess the UVs are. So I'll show you that right here, and you can see how it's just crazy. So really the better way to do it is we're actually going to go through and we're going to shade the parts of the mesh into groups that we will then merge those groups together. So here I'm going through and just making all the parts on the head red. That's going to be an individual group. I'm going to separate into like the hands and feet as a group, and then the body as a group. The other thing is, this was probably the biggest trick I learned here, is if you're still having trouble pulling it into Procreate and having trouble kind of painting it and getting the detail you want, what you should do is you can actually mask off the part that you want, and you can separate that. Now here I was trying to separate and delete the bottom of the hair. You can do that as well, because like that stuff will never be seen. But more importantly, you'll see I do it on the face a little bit later, is I'll select the face, because that's probably one of the most important areas, and I'll tell it to separate that mesh, and I will recombine it. But the trick is as long as you go through the separation part, the edges of those polys are separated and they get UV'd. It goes through the UV algorithm separately, so it doesn't get split up as much, and you'll definitely get the detail that you're going to want to create the paint on by doing that. So that's, if you have any takeaway from going through this process, I would say if there's a certain area giving you trouble as you UV and go to Procreate, it's to mask it off and tell it to split by masked, and then you can merge that geo back together. And just know that when you auto UV, it's got those kind of poly borders that it's going to pay attention to. And, you know, I wish there was a better way to select the faces and stuff so you get a little bit more specific. Unfortunately, using the mask brush isn't terribly specific, as you'll see here as they do the face. But at the end of the day, this method does work. So, and even though I'm doing it on a low poly mesh, it works just as well on a high poly mesh. So don't let that confuse you. Forger's not terribly difficult to figure out. I realize this video is sped up for speed, but there's not a lot of options in Forger at the end of the day. You should be able to figure it out. So here I'm going to go through and select the meshes that are colored separately and merge those. What happens is when you have the different meshes like that and you export it to Procreate, there'll be different layers that you can kind of turn on and off for visibility, and it treats it like different materials. So you don't want tons of materials, but you also want to have the ability to kind of turn off the arms or turn off the body and stuff to get to painting certain things. Selecting all those things, and I export it as a USD over into Procreate. And if you don't have it selected, you see it just pulled in the head. So when you switch the object type, just a little bug in Forger, it deselects all the meshes again, so you have to go through and reselect them. So here I have everything successfully ported over into Procreate. It paints pretty well. Again, the UVs aren't pretty. It's not an elegant solution, but it does work. And as long as you're not, needing to use this for like a game or something like that, this will be just fine. There was a little spot in his right eyebrow. You can kind of see it there that I just couldn't paint. And again, that's a problem with using this auto UV method, is some UVs it just doesn't like, that Forger creates. So if I really wanted to, I could have masked off those eyebrows, separated them just like I described, and then remerged the geo, and it probably would have worked. But that's such a minimal area. I went ahead and went with it, and I think it worked just fine. So in here in Procreate, I'm not really doing anything fancy. I'm just going through and blocking in the main colors. The Procreate beta allows you to kind of just tap on the geo you want to paint, and it will automatically switch to that material or layer. Procreate is such an intuitive app. It's really not hard to figure out, and you can focus on technique. Here, again, I'm kind of going through and blocking in on my main colors and then getting into detail, kind of like I do when I sculpt, is, I start on the main forms and kind of go to the secondary forms, kind of work my way through detail. Kind of played around with the different brushes. I started using the pencil The pencil, by default, it sets like the material to kind of a shiny material as you paint. I think it might, I don't know if it was metal or what it was. So I ended up just creating a custom brush. Because I'm going with this low poly look, I actually didn't want any roughness or metallic to get in the way or confuse things. So I created a custom brush in Procreate and set the 3D material to be fully rough and not metallic. Eventually what I did to fix the roughness issues, I went in and just dragged the color swatch in the roughness channels to fully white and fully black on the metallic channels. Procreate lets you do that. There's a little 3D cube on the layer you can hit to access just the roughness and metallic layers. I wanted to have a lot of fun playing around with the different Procreate brushes, so you see me kind of just mess around, and I kind of have this, I don't know if it's like a graffiti style or whatever, but just kind of, or a mixed media style, just playing around with the different brushes and kind of getting dirty with it just for fun. So here I'm working in those black highlights, well, I guess black shadow areas in the hair. I ended up really darkening up the hair using just some color adjustments in Procreate. Another awesome thing about Procreate is being able to do hue saturation or curves on a layer. I went back and looked at my Ryu reference. I hadn't gotten the gloves right. They have some writing on these pads on the backs of the hands. I ended up revisiting this one more time, redoing these one more time, and actually did the actual writing off of one of the drawings. So even though I just blocked in the text here, I decided, you know what, I've got the resolution and I can easily get to this stuff. So I'm going to go in and make it match the reference. It's little details like that I think really can be impressive on a piece of art when people are looking. It's like, oh wow, even the exact writing's there. So I didn't want to skimp on that. Here you can see me trying to get in the little crevices of the hands, and to do that all I had to do was turn off the layers, the other layers of the body and stuff, so I could easily access those things. What I'm going to do after this video is over is I'm actually going to upload this model to Sketchfab and allow it as a free download. So if any of you guys have access to the Procreate beta, or once Procreate comes out, you want to download my model and repaint it, you should be able to. You should be able to download that as a USD and pull it into Procreate. I think Sketchfab is probably a really good place to start when you're looking for models to paint in Procreate for playing around. Sketchfab will often let you export to USD, which is what Procreate needs. So just keep that in mind. There's probably a repository of awesome models that you can go in and try your painting skills out on. If you do end up repainting Ryu, I'd love to see it. I think there's a whole slew of different styles and ways you could go about painting him. It'd especially be interesting to see someone really go in and try to paint more of a detailed look in the clothing folds and the muscles. Here I'm kind of painting in AO or painting in shadow, darkening up those areas that don't get a lot of light hitting them. Another thing I love about being able to paint and Procreate is the smudge tool. So, I'll lock in some color and I'll switch into the smudge tool to kind of fade it out. So not a lot to say here other than, taking advantage of Procreate and all the fun brushes, trying different things. You can see that it got that blue that was initially painted in there in Forger when I had separated things out. So sometimes if you smudge, it'll like smudge from the pieces of geo that aren't seen, and it'll bring that color back in. So I kind of wrestled with that a little bit here and there. I'm going in with some darker tones on the muscles and painting those in. And in the meantime here, I'm trying some halftone brushes. Again, I love Procreate's brushes. They're a lot of fun to mess with. And I'm also, Here I'm working in some red tone, and then I'm switching that to like an overlay mode. Trying out the different blend modes of painting is a lot of fun too. I know a lot of people they'll paint like shadow as like a multiply mode and highlight as a screen or an add mode. I don't really do that here, but rather I just like to work in some, some blush or some blood areas with the red as an overlay mode. And painting in the shadows, smudging those back out, getting those to blend well. So the other thing I would really like to see in this process that I just really wish there was a way to take this model back into Nomad so I could light it in Nomad and get all those cool features. Unfortunately, Nomad currently doesn't support UVs. I'm kind of holding out hope that that might change in the future, because it would be so awesome to paint this model and bring it back into Nomad for final lighting, maybe add a glowing sphere in his hands. But I just couldn't do that. So really, outside of going from Procreate, really the next step is maybe to pull it into Sketchfab, which I do. Sketchfab isn't built for iPad, so you can do some stuff in iPad, but at the end of the day, I had to do the final dialing in on the PC just for moving lights around. Unfortunately, I hope that's something they improve in the future, just the ability to tweak the 3D settings of the model on the iPad better. But one thing I will do is switch it into AR mode. That's always fun to see here in Procreate. So here you see him sitting on my table, and I can scale him up, turn him around. And man, the AR mode works so well in Procreate. It's a lot of fun to do. You had to make sure that his feet are on the origin, which again I did in Forger. It's probably something you could do in Nomad as well. But just you need to make sure that happens before you get to Procreate, because you cannot adjust it in Procreate. So that looks cool, and this is what he looks like when he's lit up in Sketchfab, and we've got all that cool rendering going on. Again, if I could have gotten back in Nomad, I probably could have gotten this exact same look. But hey, now it's on Sketchfab. Go download them, check them out, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.